The best way to challenge this naturalisation of capitalist relations of production is to create alternative relations of production within capitalism. We're not going to make what we were discussing earlier, the great leap to socialism. It may happen, there may be a workers' revolution globally, but it's very unlikely. I don't think even a lot of Marxists are sitting on the edge of their seats waiting for that. But you mentioned Sweden and other countries earlier, which have broadly been seen for some time now as progressive social democracy. We do need to remember, social democracies rather, we do need to remember that in countries like Sweden and Norway, the development of social democracy in those countries in the late 19th century was coterminous with the winning of the franchise, with universal suffrage. And it's a very important distinction between social democracy in mainland Europe as well and Britain. The origins of British social democracy are quite different. And that historical legacy, I think, has informed the history of the Labour Party in the 20th century. But you know, thinking about countries like Sweden and Denmark and Germany as well, for that matter, what we have witnessed in the 20th century are different models of capitalism, as well as different models of social democracy. Now, it's true that the European social model has been under increasing stress, and it's in fact it barely exists today. But you know, we are obviously in an era of, if you like, of second wave neoliberalism, and I think the extent to which the left in Scotland will be able to resist that will be decided after 2014. I think if Scotland remains in the part of the UK, I think the prospects for the left in Scotland themselves are going to be very bleak, and apart from the prospects and the future for the Scottish working class. If, however, Scotland becomes independent, I think there is that alternative future that's available to us, which I would argue only independence can deliver. I don't think the British are ever going to deliver this.
Okay. One of the ways that many people hope that a move to the left can happen is as we move away from an oil economy and onto a more renewables-based economy. But this is very interesting, both politically and economically and culturally in Scotland at the moment, because a lot in the independence movement we're saying, no, we're going to be rich, look at all this oil. And we're also saying, but we've got all this renewable power as well. And the world has to move in one direction. There's not really any choice about where we have to go. Personally, I think that one of the interesting things about this in general, not just Scotland, is that one of the reasons we're not moving to our green economy as fast as we need to be and build the massive infrastructure that we need, one of the reasons we're not doing it quickly enough is because it's harder for the capitalists to find justifications to say, I own the wind, I own the sun. It's harder for them to close off that little bit of the commons than it is to say, I own this oil well that you can't see or you can't feel on your face. I know it seems a bit kind of romantic way to look at it, but I think it's one of the reasons we're not moving in that direction quickly enough. But there's this kind of strange almost hypocrisy in Scotland with them. We're green, we're rich, we've got all this oil, we're rich. And where do you think this stands? So if Scotland becomes independent, we could be at the behest of the oil companies, or we could be moving in this green environmental direction, or a bit of both. Where do you think this would come out in an independent Scotland?
Well, I think if you were to look at this through the prism of the SNP, I think to coin a phrase, I think they clearly do want the best of both worlds. I mean, one of the things about oil, it is true, of course, that the present prices, and there's every reason to believe that oil prices will, if anything, will increase in future decades, particularly given the rate of growth of China and other BRIC countries. Oil is valued at about £1.5 trillion, and that's a huge resource. But of course, what we have to remember is, if Scotland is going to exploit those reserves in the future, many of those oil fields are increasingly risky, and of course they become increasingly costly as they become increasingly risky. If oil prices should fall, then clearly those fields are not going to be developed. But where I would stand on oil is I'd be quite happy to leave all the oil that's present in the North Sea. That's probably not a very popular thing for anybody who supports independence to say, but it seems to me that there's a huge contradiction in the SNP's agenda, and it's clear that the SNP does subscribe to a growth agenda. No difference between the SNP, Labour and the Tories there. But they also want to embrace this kind of cosmetic greening of policies and the way that they've embraced the possibility of renewables. And that seems to me a circle that can't be squared, to fall back on oil reserves, which will need to be exploited for the next 3-4 decades and until the field's reserves are exhausted, whilst at the same time advocating the greening of policy. That doesn't make sense to me. Mm-hmm. But I appreciate that's not going to be a very popular opinion with what we might call mainstream nationalist opinion, but I don't think I don't think the left should be here to placate mainstream nationalism.
But to touch on what you were saying before, do you think like not the greening of policy, but an actual shift to a renewable economy could bring about the kind of, so in Scotland particularly, or in the world in the grander scale, do you think that a move to the more green economy could bring about some of the changes you would like to see? Oh,
definitely. We have to wean ourselves off the growth agenda. Capital is reaching the limits of its growth. I think we touched on this earlier, that Britain's a good example of that. Britain has been in crisis since the late 1960s. British capital's response, as well as global capital's response to that, has been to adopt a neoliberal agenda, adopt globalisation, promote financialisation. These are not accidents of history. These are capitalism's response to the crisis that has been developing in the late 1960s. And I think, although obviously capital will try to sell itself as being able to adopt this green agenda, particularly with renewables, and to make that consistent with the growth agenda, again, there are so many inconsistencies there, and I don't think the left should buy into this kind of narrative, or whatever you want to call it, at all. But as far as renewables are concerned, clearly the costs of investment are huge just now, and obviously one of the arguments against independence is that Scotland needs to remain part of the UK in order to enjoy the economies of scale that being part of the UK would provide as far as renewable investment is concerned. But of course, what we need to acknowledge is Scotland has already attracted a lot of inward investment, and there's no reason to believe that won't continue. And again, it's not to idealise the future or romanticize the future. It's something that the left must always resist, and of course it is an instinct, not just on people on the left, but on anyone who takes a future-oriented perspective. Which, of course, with independence you must. I think it's one of the radical differences between the Yes campaign and the No campaign is the No campaign is very much defending the past and a very distorted perspective on the present and the near future, whereas I think the Yes campaign is very much oriented to the future for democracy, the development of Scotland's economy, and also to address many of the social and economic issues that that have been exacerbated in Scotland precisely because Scotland has been part of the UK, particularly over the last 4 decades since neoliberalism really kicked in terms of its effects in Scotland.
I'm sure many of the SNP members or policymakers would suggest that, just on the same point, that the idea would be to take the oil money in the short term in order to build the green economy in the long term.
Yeah, I mean it's a kind of constant refrain from many in the SNP, that we have this resource. Why would we leave this? Why would we be the only country in the world to leave this resource in underwater? It's a compelling argument in many ways, because clearly it is a huge resource, and it will yield returns to Scotland, for an independent Scotland for several decades into the future. And of course, I suppose you could argue as well, which I think the SNP does argue, that the resources from oil could be allocated to an oil fund. And clearly Scotland's in no position, and is never going to be in any position, to rival the oil fund that a country like Norway has. But again, that's no excuse not to start one now. And that those resources could be used to finance a lot of inward investment in renewables in Scotland. But again, that strikes me as being perverse, to use a dirty energy production and consumption to finance clean energy production and consumption. That just doesn't make sense.
Okay. Another interesting aspect in this is there's a lot of young voters in Scotland, and we talked earlier about how it's a very generational thing. You'll find that younger Scots are very pro-independence, whereas older Scots, the wartime generation, tend to be less so. But there's a new generation coming in the new cohort, I think.
Sure, yes, yeah.
So these people are new voters, floating voters, that are just beginning to vote, and also with the possible 16-year-olds and 17-year-olds voting. I did some research for this recently, and there are only about 3 countries in the world where 16-year-olds can vote.
Sure.
There's a few where 17-year-olds can vote, and there is one where 16-year-olds can vote, but only if they go with their parents, which I thought was quite funny.
Yes, yeah.
I can't remember which one it was. But it's kind of like going to an 18 film or something. You can go if you go with your dad. Sure. But it's a bit bizarre. But how do you think this is going to affect the picture?
Well, I think new cohorts do form an important part of any electorate, and I think this will be no more true than in the independence referendum. I mean, there are 2 types of new cohorts: the electoral new cohorts, if you like, people who are newly enfranchised with each general election. But more broadly, the new cohorts are those first 3 generations of new electoral new cohorts who haven't yet developed voting patterns and haven't developed loyalties to any, or many of them haven't developed loyalties to any political party. And in the case of the independence campaign, to any particular campaign. And one of the reasons this constituency is so important, apart from the fact that they comprise almost a quarter of the total Scottish electorate, even though they do historically have a lower propensity to vote.
Though the quarter is a high number. It's a
yeah. But even with a lower turnout of around 50%, that's still round about 450 to 550,000 voters. So the campaign that can win a majority of that number of votes is going to be in a very good position to win the referendum. But one of the reasons that new cohorts are so important is because with many new cohorts, what they tend to do, and there's an awful lot of research on this, is they tend to remain undecided until very late in the stages of an election campaign, or in the case of the independence referendum, the independence referendum campaign. And what they're waiting for, many of them, is waiting to see which side, which party or which campaign is going to form a winning coalition in the election. There's a very important objective there for both campaigns, but I think particularly for the Yes campaign, given the point you made that many younger voters, obviously not all of them, many younger voters are certainly more receptive to the arguments for independence. And again, many younger voters are more future oriented than more established cohorts. And again, it's similar to the difference between the broad difference between the Yes and No campaigns. The Yes campaign, I think, is broadly more future oriented. The No campaign is much more oriented to defending the past. The key objective one of the key objectives for the Yes campaign is to try to win, or should be to try to win, a majority of these new cohorts. Bear in mind also that depending on which opinion poll you believe, somewhere between 15 to 20% of voters currently are undecided in Scotland. They're not committed to one side, one campaign or the other. I think that's good news for the Yes campaign, given that we've been through a festival of Britishness in 2012, an ongoing festival of Britishness. The fact that there's still 1/5 of the Scottish electorate who are open-minded enough, sceptical enough, however you want to put it, about Britishness to not be decided and how they're going to vote in 2014 is very important I think more important for the Yes campaign than for the No campaign.
I hate throwing in, there's always, in this kind of discussion, there's always the kind of, and we need an internet question now, and I don't like this, the standard thing in an academic course. We have all the questions about politics, and we need some kind of internet question.
Right. Yeah.
But I hate doing that. But do you think that the Yes vote or the kind of SNP Yes campaign have a step ahead on the internet? I don't know how often you're there. I don't use Facebook, but independence and Yes is all over Twitter. The No campaign seems to be most strongly represented by George Fultz, which is a permanent boost for the Yes campaign. There's too many brilliant bloggers to mention, but the Yes campaign seems to have a real step ahead in the social media at the moment.
I mean, I think you have to obviously be careful to kind of remove any or try to distance yourself from any internal bias here. But I think broadly the impression I get is that limiting the perspective to the blogosphere is that the pro-independence blocs seem to be much more enlightened than the anti-independence blocs, the unionist blocs, whatever you want to call them. And I think that reflects something that's actually much deeper, because there's, again, a much greater left orientation in the Yes campaign's bloc.